Today at the National Press Club, the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, fresh from delivering his second budget and forecasting a surplus for the first time in 15 years. He's balancing relief for Australians doing it tough with the challenge of tackling inflation. Jim Chalmers with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, coming to you today from the Great Hall in Parliament House on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. My name is Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. Treasurer Jim Chalmers has been in office for less than a year and has already delivered 2 budgets. Yet the theme of last night's budget was stronger foundations for a better future. There was more cleaning up of the budget books last night. The majority of a massive revenue windfall was banked. Medicare bulk billing was propped up, and there were measures to ease the cost of living for those on low incomes. But the Stronger Foundations theme suggests the Treasurer's work may have just begun. Please join me in welcoming him to address us today.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Morris and the staff and the board for the invitation back to the Press Club and to Laura Tingle for the characteristically kind introduction. I acknowledge the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. I thank the sponsors, principally Chris and Westpac and all of the sponsors, and I thank all of you for being here once again today. Now, like many of you, I've become accustomed to the rituals of Budget Week, having now been involved in something like 17 of them. The long, chilly walk to the Tuesday morning doorstop, the lock-up, the Wednesday media blitz, right down to Shane Wright's choice of socks. And of course, the welcome, even cherished responsibility of speaking with you today to put the budget in its proper context and to share the proper credit. It's been really pleasing to see many of you in the press gallery notice that what we've tried to do in the lead up to this budget is to do things a little bit differently. By which I mean we've tried to involve more ministers, consistent with the inclusive and generous way that our Prime Minister leads his team, and I want to acknowledge that. The many Cabinet colleagues having addressed this club just in the space of the last month, I think, is just one piece of evidence of that more inclusive leadership style. I started knocking around here when Peter Costello was the Treasurer, and I've always found it a bit strange that budgets get individualised as much as they do. It's true that there's only one of us at the dispatch box on the night, but there are 2 names on the budget, there are 23 Cabinet Ministers who decide it, the work of thousands of people behind it, and the aspirations of millions of people wrapped up in it. So one of the really key reasons I look forward to this part of a big week is because it does provide an opportunity to sincerely thank everyone who put it together. I want to acknowledge the Finance Minister, such an extraordinary friend and colleague, strong and selfless and so valued and indispensable in our team. I have frankly never worked with a better person, and I ask you to put your hands together for Katie Gallagher. I want to acknowledge the Prime Minister again and thank him for being here today, but most of all, thank him for providing the leadership behind this budget. I want to thank our colleagues on the Expenditure Review Committee for providing the scrutiny, ministers and caucus members for providing all of the ideas, every one of them well motivated and some of them affordable. I want to acknowledge Stephen Kennedy and the Treasury team. I'm so lucky to work with Stephen and his colleagues. I want to acknowledge Jenny Wilkinson's Finance Department as well, the Cabinet Secretariat and the broader public service under Glyn Davis's leadership for providing the professionalism and the expertise. I want to thank my community for providing the inspiration. I want to thank my wife Laura, my kids who sat through the speech last night. It means a lot to me that you're here. I want to thank you for providing the love and support at home. And I hope you won't mind me singling out someone else who has become like family to us. A big sister to me and an auntie to our kids, a friend and conspirator with Laura and John and Mum, but more than that as well. Barbara Peeney has been working for senior Labor people in this building and the one down the hill since the late 1980s, when she showed up for her first job with then Deputy Prime Minister Lionel Bowen. In the 3.5 decades since, she's worked for 8 frontbenchers in 10 stints, 2 Deputy Prime Ministers, 3 Treasurers, 2 Shadow Treasurers, 2 Finance Ministers and a Labor leader. And Barb's been the heart and soul of the 3 offices that I've worked with her in, Kim Beazley's, Wayne Swan's and now mine. And she is the personification of what Graham Freudenberg's meant when he described the Labor Party as collective memory in action. She's unsung, but she is absolutely unequalled in work ethic and commitment to her family and our country and the need to do the right thing by each other. Now, the first reason I mention her today is that the 2023 budget is Barb's last budget. Some of you know that she's said this before, but this time I fear Barb means it. And it says something about her humility, that guessing that I'd mention her today, she preferred to watch this from the office with our kids. But she'll hear us in the ministerial wing. If you could please join me in thanking her with a loud round of applause. Now, I start with Barb to pay tribute to her, but also to put into some historical context the budget that we handed down last night. You see, Barb began here towards the end of the Cold War, a couple of years before one recession, and she'll be leaving a couple of years after the subsequent one, almost 30 years apart. At the start of that period, Australia was positioning itself to find its way and its place in what would be an era of convergence. And it seemed conceivable then that the big divisions in ideology and economics might end in a settlement of sorts. And in the corridors of this building, the great Labor project of that time, opening Australia up to the world, was underway. And so was a 3-decade expansion that became the envy of the world, enduring through a global financial crisis. And in that time, not in one standout moment, but steadily, the liberal democratic world began to fragment. Economies became stale and stagnant. Opportunities shrank and suspicion grew that the system was working against ordinary people and that the future belonged to somebody else's kids. Uncertainty, insecurity and vulnerability came to define the times. And multiple crises in a decade and a half, financial, biological, economic, geopolitical, only accelerated some of these really worrying trends. Nationalistic ideologues found fertile new ground and autocrats mounted new challenges. It's now expressed most shockingly tens of thousands of kilometres away in the bombing of hospitals and apartment blocks in Dnipro and Mariupol, and in the drastic set of disruptions that it's caused in the global economy, especially in energy markets, all coming at us from around the world but felt around the kitchen tables here at home. Now, in the sweep of all of this, we come to office and we hand down 2 budgets in 7 months. The first one was to bed down our commitments and align our fiscal and economic strategies for the start of a new government. This second budget has a much, much harder task: to serve our urgent priorities and our generational responsibilities at the same time, to act as a hinge point between the end of a wasted decade and the beginning of a defining decade chock full of opportunities, to shore up our path through some hazardous terrain, but to set us up for broader, long-term success in our society and our economy as well, and to make sure that the benefits and opportunities of this moment are shared right across our continent and right across our communities. Now, this meant working to 3 sets of influences simultaneously. First, in the near term, a domestic economy characterised by persistent inflation, slowing due to global pressures and rate rises, but benefiting from low unemployment, stronger wages growth and high prices for our exports. Second, a bottom line benefiting substantially this year and next, boosted by the restraint that we've shown in 2 budgets, but with structural pressures that remain. And third, recognition that the next generation of economic growth will be powered by different forces than the last, by our ability to manage and maximise the big geopolitical and fiscal and demographic influences and make the most of the big shifts that we outlined in Budget Statement 4, namely the growth in the care economy, fast technological change and the vast industrial opportunities of net zero. So the job of the budget and the balance I think we struck well was to see us through, but also to look beyond. And by now, you're familiar with how we're going about that task. You know that we're expecting a small surplus this year and smaller deficits after that, avoiding hundreds of billions of dollars in debt. You've seen the $14.6 billion cost of living package we're delivering that prioritises support for those most in need without neglecting Middle Australia. The big announcement of last night, tripling the bulk billing incentive. The initiatives we're pursuing to broaden women's economic participation. And you've also seen the predictable political responses from our opponents, the people who made the mess and spent years trying to cover it up, now complaining that the clean-up is taking too long. The same characters who now claim they've supported all along the energy bill relief that they voted against in the Parliament just in December. Now, as always, there are some who think that we're doing too much in this budget. There are others that think we aren't doing enough. That's perennial. The PRRT is a good example of this, and so is social security. But our job is to make the right decisions for the right reasons. I think we have done that, and I think we are doing that in the budget. Now, I wanted to take a few minutes today to focus on three mutually reinforcing parts of the budget which I think are particularly important. The first, our efforts to improve the budget. Second, what we're doing to address inflation. And third, our plans for growth. First, our efforts to improve the budget. Here we sought to build on the example we set in our last budget, but in slightly different circumstances. In October, we returned 99% of upward revisions to revenue over 2 years, well above the historical norm, but necessary to make sure we weren't adding to inflation and to begin the journey towards budget repair. And we wouldn't be forecasting a surplus now without that effort. We wouldn't be anywhere near it without that fiscal discipline that we showed. And 7 months later, inflation is still with us and big structural pressures on the budget remain, meaning that our emphasis on restraint continues. But what you saw last night was a similar but not quite identical approach, and that's for three reasons. Firstly, our economy is slowing. So putting our foot too hard on the brake, we might have done more harm than good. Secondly, we discovered a new range of expiring measures and mismanaged mess that we had to clean up. And three, we needed to do what we responsibly could to meet our other priorities, delivering support in tough times and investing in our future growth prospects. And that all resulted in a carefully calibrated strategy of returning 82% of revenue improvements in this budget, 87% over the last two budgets, a very significant commitment to getting our budget back on track, which becomes especially clear when you look back on recent history. The $208 billion of revenue upgrades that we've returned during our time in government has led to the biggest turnaround in the budget in dollar terms on record. And it's enabled us to forecast a surplus ahead of the other major advanced economies. Now, if we'd followed the example of our predecessors who returned around 40% of revenue upgrades to the bottom line, we'd be forecasting deficits of around $40 billion rather than a surplus of $4.2 billion. Instead, because of our commitment to responsibility and restraint, we'll have less debt and less interest costs, all while funding the services and programs that our predecessors were going to let expire, delivering help to people in need and investing in the drivers of our future prosperity. But obviously, that doesn't mean that our work is done. You all saw yesterday that the welcome improvement to our short-term position won't make all of our structural spending pressures go away. The NDIS and interest costs remain the most prominent of the big five you're all aware of, which also includes health and defence and aged care. But those two fastest growing areas are also now the most prominent areas of improvement and progress. Our commitment to banking revenue upgrades means we'll have $300 billion less debt, saving us around $83 billion of interest costs by the end of the medium term. And while the commitments of the Prime Minister and the states on the NDIS will secure its future and reduce payments growth, this, combined with some modest but meaningful tax changes to improve our revenue base, all of this has contributed significantly to a marked decline in the structural deficit by the end of the medium term. Now, the restraint that characterises that fiscal strategy was also key to dealing with the inflationary challenge. Our budget is contractionary when inflation is at its highest this year, the result of our efforts to improve the fiscal position by around $125 billion over 2 years since coming to government. And this represents a turnaround of around 3.6 percentage points of GDP in 22-23, a 1.8 percentage point turnaround in the next as well. All this means that our fiscal position is clearly not working against the Reserve Bank. And this budget's focus on inflation went beyond our fiscal strategy and right to the heart of the carefully calibrated cost of living relief that we chose to deliver. There's been a lot of focus in the last 12 or 15 hours or so on whether this package adds to inflation, so let me make a few things really clear. One, of the total spending we announced for next year, more than a quarter of the net impact relates to keeping existing government programs going and extending pandemic support. Two, in total, the targeted relief that we're delivering in 23-24 costs around 0.1% of GDP. And three, it's been designed to provide effective, meaningful relief to households throughout the year, not in one big hit. For all these reasons, the Treasury advice to us was that none of what we're doing here will have a counterproductive impact. What's more, our targeted interventions in those areas where price pressures are most acute will directly take the pressure off inflation by some 3/4 of a percentage point next year. And that means inflation will be lower in 2023-24 than what we forecast in October. Still higher than we'd like and still more persistent than is ideal, but down from what we would have been and making a meaningful difference to families and others around the country as a consequence. So inflation was central to our thinking in how we went about providing relief to households, in the execution of our fiscal strategy, but also in how we thought about growth. Our goal here has always been to engage on the supply side of the economy by investing in people, in productivity and participation, and in the biggest single opportunity of this defining decade, the energy transformation in particular. And you saw last night that the additional $4 billion we dedicated to the energy transformation brought this government's investment in the industrial and economic opportunities of cleaner and cheaper energy to $40 billion, making it a central focus of our growth strategy. And today I want to explain why. At the start of my remarks, I referred to the era of economic progress that our Labor predecessors saw us through, a series of big set pieces designed to unlock the shackles on our economy and make the most of this transformative era of openness taking hold around the world. Today, the task of our generation is to find the right policy levers to make the most of an entirely different transformation, this time in energy. And when I think where Australia fits into the global story, one fact really springs to mind. We have an abundance of the resources that will power the world's efforts to combat climate change and the potential to produce renewable energy at a lower cost than the rest of the world. This means that cheap, renewable power can act as a fundamental comparative advantage on which we can build new ones as well, especially when other countries in our region don't have access to the same plentiful renewable power that we do. That's why we're so focused on the industrial opportunities of net zero. And the journey that we're on here is not just about reducing the energy costs of existing businesses, as important as that is. It's also creating space for the creation of new ones and all of the dynamism that comes from that. But if we are to succeed here, we need to do more than just transform our grid. Countries around the world are making moves and making strategic investments in the new industries of the net zero economy. And that obviously includes the United States through its Inflation Reduction Act, but it extends to Canada and Europe and more. Now, we could have seen this as a threat, or just let the opportunities of this defining decade fall to others. But instead, we see it as our big challenge and our big chance to partner with friends and allies to take our central place in the new developing supply chains of the net zero economy, in hydrogen, in battery components, green metals and more. That's why you've seen in this budget and the last a long-term signal to key markets and clear practical actions to encourage productivity-enhancing investment in the industries we can thrive in. A safeguard mechanism that provides certainty for business. New targeted investments in our hydrogen future last night. A national reconstruction fund that will partner with private industry to move up and along new renewable value chains. And targeted incentives for households and small business to reduce their energy usage and save on their bills. Now, as a Labor government, we want the opportunities associated with these new and growing industries to be available to as many Australians in as many parts of the country as possible. And you saw that last night in our announcements of more than $1.4 billion to support regional decarbonisation, a new net zero authority and an historic skills agreement as well. And it's also a big part of why we're putting in place a new framework to address disadvantage in communities like the one that I grew up in and represent now, focusing on people and place and local knowledge and the power of communities to gather people in, to lift them up and to expand and broaden opportunity in our society. And in many ways, what aligns, what unites our approach to disadvantage, our approach to growth, a lot of what's in last night's budget, is an effort to try and cooperate across state boundaries and with communities wherever and whenever we can, working together so that what would otherwise pass as moments in time become staging points in progress. I'm confident that that's how this budget will be seen, just like the one prior and ideally the one to come as well. Points at which we can reflect on what's in the budget papers themselves, but also in what's happening all around them. Because in this budget you can trace the through lines of our first year in government. The Jobs and Skills Summit here and our delivery of 300,000 fee-free TAFE places from next year. Upgrading our emissions reduction targets and legislating the safeguard mechanism earlier this year, a framework for the energy transformation initiatives we've spoken about today. Making economic equality for women a priority, driving cheaper early childhood education, enhancing parental leave and now delivering support for single parents and especially single mums. Commissioning the Defence Strategic Review, delivering the AUKUS agreement and rehabilitating Australia's diplomatic relationships, and I see Richard is here today. Investments in our national security and our regional stability funded in this budget, Mr Penny Wong and others who are here. In health, supporting the hospital system through this new phase of the pandemic, funding to keep our kids safe from the dangers of vaping, and I pay tribute to Mark Butler, and securing Medicare's future. And in our commitment to getting wages moving again, the passage of secure jobs and better pay and funding a decent pay rise for aged care workers. But this hasn't been a hurricane of initiatives without purpose or without coherence, or a series of policies designed solely with a decent press release in mind. This Prime Minister sets a higher standard for his government. Ambitious, yes, but also willing to make the tough decisions and the hard choices in a methodical and considered and sequenced way, so that when we take a moment to pause and take stock after almost a year in office, it's clear that what might otherwise seem like a flurry of activity is actually just an adult government working calmly and collaboratively through its agenda. So when President Biden and Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Kishida arrive this month, they will no doubt recognise some of the hard choices that we're grappling with here in Australia. But I hope they also recognise a country finding opportunity in the challenges that we face and gaining confidence through the choices that we take together. A country that is on a journey towards a more inclusive, more resilient, dynamic economy, increasingly powered by renewable energy and true to the character of its people, smart and practical and resilient, with an inherent sense of fairness and optimism. This is the same spirit, the same decency and positivity that the referendum for a voice is built on. Now, almost directly above us, you can find Tom Roberts' famous painting of the opening of the first Parliament, which was actually 122 years ago yesterday. 10 steps away from that, are the Yirrkala bark petitions presented to the Parliament in 1963, almost the midpoint of the journey between the Australia of Federation and the Australia of today. The confident call for recognition and respect that Yunupingu helped to draft, something that wouldn't have even seemed vaguely possible to those in Tom Roberts' sights. And yet, in the same Parliament, around 60 years later, that document was tabled and it was recognised. In many ways, the space between those 2 points in our history is vast, but here you can walk between them easily. And that is the gift that we seek to bestow onto the next generation of Australians who walk through this place and walk through our country. To do the work, to do what seems difficult now, so that they too can walk with ease between new reminders of the staging points of progress that we are creating. The referendum that will take place later this year is one of those markers, a chance for us to rise to the moment, and I'm confident that we will. And that's what I was getting at last night when I was talking about a Commonwealth of common purpose. We have always been ready to tackle the big challenges and seize these big chances, and that is what the Voice is about. It's also what the budget was about. It's what Anthony's government is all about. Having the confidence and the courage to shape the future on our terms and in our interests. Recognising, listening, moving forward together in a spirit of unity and respect. Sharing the belief that out of all of this uncertainty and all of this adversity of the last few years that Australians have handled with such resilience and strength, a much better future awaits. And I'm proud of the budget that will help build it. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Treasurer. And I'd just point out to our media members that we've got question time today, so it's going to be a hard out, so please respect the one question rule. An issue that's been buzzing around the building this morning, Treasurer, which would be good to get some clarity on, is you've done a lot for women's equality in this budget, particularly for single mothers, as you say, but for single parenting payment recipients, they haven't been included in the $40 increase given to most other recipients, which seems to be, unfortunate to say the least, given the pressures they're under and what you've been trying to do for them by increasing the age limit. Why aren't they included?
Well, the $40 base rate increase to JobSeeker and some of the other working age payments was all about addressing the lowest payments in the system. When it comes to parenting payment single, what we've done is quite dramatically expand the eligibility for that. Pay tribute to Anthony and Katie and Amanda Rishworth for the work that they've done on that, but also the community advocates. And what it means is if you're on parenting payment single, the difference between that and JobSeeker is about $177 a fortnight. And so parenting payment single is already a higher rate, about 95% of the age pension as I understand it. We're expanding eligibility for it, and we're introducing more generous income arrangements for it as well. And so our motivations there, the way that we went about making that decision was to give the base rate increase to the lowest payments. And this particular payment, which more people are eligible for and can work more and still receive it, is already $177 bigger than JobSeeker.
Next question is from Michelle Grattan.
Michelle Grattan from The Conversation. Treasurer, apart from your program for disadvantaged communities, there doesn't seem to be much in this budget to try to use this time of a very tight labour market to get longer-term unemployed people into the workforce. Do you think this should be a priority? Are you satisfied with the employment services in that they're attending to this? And will you make it a central feature of the jobs, the white paper on employment that is to come?
Thanks, Michelle, and yes, I will, and yes, we are. Workforce participation is one of the big driving forces behind so much of what we've done in the first 12 months, and it will be a big influence on our thinking on what we do from here. The employment white paper is the perfect opportunity for us to consider some of these questions. There's a committee being led by Julian Hill with other colleagues on it looking at employment services, and clearly we can do better there. Because I've always been concerned about, if not obsessed about, the fact that even in a country that's got 3.5% national unemployment, there are still pockets of our country and our communities, including the ones that I grew up in and represent now, where we just haven't been able to attach enough people to the opportunities that a growing job-creating economy can provide. There has been a mismatch for too long. And the place-based initiatives, which you referenced in your question, they're an important part of that. I've seen how they can work in local communities like mine, and I want to expand them and lean more heavily on them. But you're right, if your question is that we need to do more beyond that, yes we do, yes we are, yes we will. Our existing participation agenda, whether it's cheaper early childhood education or some of the other steps that we're taking to make training more accessible to more people, that's part of that story, but you'll see more of that in the white paper.
David Crowe.
Thanks, Laura. David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age of Melbourne. Thanks for your speech, Treasurer. Clearly there's a major debate this morning about the impact of this budget on inflation, different views from different economists on that. You've pointed to the budget papers and the energy package, putting that downward pressure on inflation. However, at the same time, in the budget papers, total payments from the Commonwealth sector will go up by 3.7% in real terms over the coming financial year. So that's still a significant amount of money going into the economy when there are these concerns about inflation and the impact on interest rates. When the Reserve Bank meets next month, if they put up interest rates, will that be your fault?
Well, first of all, obviously I don't preempt the decisions taken independently by the Reserve Bank Board. Never have, never will. Don't intend to do that today. But really the defining influence on our decisions around the cost of living package, our decisions around the growth package and the historic restraint that we've shown in spending has been this inflation challenge. And we are supremely confident that the budget that we handed down last night will take some of these cost of living pressures off without adding to inflation. And really the main conversation that hung over all of the decisions that the Expenditure Review Committee and the Cabinet took was a version of this question. And the very clear advice, as I ran through in the prepared remarks a moment ago, is that the fact that such a big proportion of that spending in 23-24 is legacy issues that we had to clean up. The fact that the cost of living package only adds 0.1% of GDP in that period. The fact that our energy plan, the combination of the price caps and the bill relief takes 3/4 of a click off inflation next year, all of these things I think are important demonstrations for why so many of the bank economists in particular have come out today and said at worst the impact on the economy is neutral, and many of them have said better than that. There won't be unanimity about that. You can always find if you look hard enough, you can always find a view at either end of the spectrum, but we're really confident that we got the balance right. We're giving people a bit of help without making the cost of living challenge worse.
Patrick Commons.
Patrick Commons from the Australian newspaper. A major component of the self-healing budget over the coming decade is the big changes to the forecast around cost in the NDIS. It's gone from almost 14% a year to a bit over 10%. How can you justify booking such a major saving on the NDIS over the coming decade without actually having taken the policy decisions to justify that saving?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Two things in response to your question. First of all, this notion of self-healing. When governments get an upward revision to revenue, as governments of both political persuasions have at times over the 20 or so years I've been knocking around here, they've got a choice to make. How much of that they spend and how much of that they bank, that is a really key decision, and it's a hard decision. So it doesn't feel self-healing when you're sitting around the Expenditure Review Committee table and colleagues have got terrific ideas and you've got to work out what you can afford to spend because your overwhelming priority is spending restraint to fix the budget, to avoid these debt interest payments as much as you can. And so I reject the idea that there is something automatic about the restraint that we showed in the budget. There are hard decisions associated with not spending much at all of the upward revision in revenue. When it comes to the NDIS, if you think about it, the 5 fastest growing areas of the budget, which those of you who join me in the blue room from time to time are probably sick of hearing about, the 2 fastest are the NDIS and interest costs, and that's where we've made the most progress in the budget. Avoiding hundreds of billions of dollars in debt gets the interest bill down, as you know, but also the work that, and I pay tribute to Bill Shorten, who's here, the Prime Minister and the National Cabinet. What we're trying to do here is there's been progress in the near term. The increased costs on the NDIS would have been something like $17 billion. Instead, the decisions taken meant that we took about $15 billion of that off the table. At the same time as we work with the states and territories and with the NDIA and the sector and others to moderate some of the growth in costs in the scheme. And our objective here, our primary objective, is not actually budget repair when it comes to the NDIS. Our primary objective, as I've heard Bill say eloquently time and time again, is to make sure that the money is going to the people the system was designed to serve. That's our first priority. And in order to ensure that, we've got to make sure that the increase in costs are sustainable, that we get a handle on these costs. So that's our motivation. We also want to get a handle on the growth in costs. That's what the 8% target is all about. It's making a difference in the structural position of the budget, as someone like yourself would have noticed in the medium-term graphs.
Anna Henderson.
Thank you. Anna Henderson, SBS World News and NITV. Treasurer, you're taking a $2 billion gamble, according to some scientists, on green hydrogen. The US is investing $369 billion on sweeteners for clean energy. What do you say to those who are characterising this as $2 billion for Andrew Forrest and Fortescue, because other international investors will be attracted to the US, where there's more on offer? And how can you characterise your ambition as becoming a clean energy superpower when there's so much money on offer elsewhere?
Look, the view that you've expressed is not the mainstream view in the investor community that I knock around in and Chris Bowen and others interact with as ministers. You know, the mainstream view is that hydrogen is a big, big chance for Australia. And with the Americans piling in so much cash into grants and subsidies, the Canadians, the Europeans following suit in one way or another, we've got to work out what is our slice of the action here, and hydrogen is going to be a big part of that, because of also what it means for green metals and the rest of it. And so the overwhelming feedback that I get, you know, I convene an investor roundtable with a couple of $1 trillion of assets around the table. Chris and Jenny McAllister were there last time that we met. Investors see this as a big opportunity. And the hydrogen head start that was announced in the budget last night, the $2 billion that you refer to, Anna, is a production credit of sorts to try and incentivise an area where we're going to have massive advantages into the future. Now, if you'd said to me 10 or 15 years ago that $2 billion to contribute to this big opportunity, this big industrial opportunity, was premature, then maybe that would have been the case. But now I'm really confident that this is a good part of the developments in clean energy technology that we should be part of. There will be a competitive process to bid for this production credit, very competitive process. So it will involve a lot of players, not just the ones that you mentioned.
Phil Curry.
Hi, Treasurer. Phil Curry from the AFR.
Hi, Phil.
Hi, mate. In this place last year, when you were still Shadow Treasurer, I asked you about, in the pre-election budget speech, about the tax to GDP ratio.
It's ringing a bell, yeah.
It is, and you said you wouldn't adopt the coalition's self-imposed limit of 23.9%. The budget papers yesterday show that is going to be reached next financial year, and then afterwards, I assume on the back of stage 3, it'll fall back to 29.3. I know you don't...
Sorry, beg your pardon?
It'll fall back in the year afterwards to about 29.3. So, sorry, it'll go under the cap. I know you don't have a cap, but you said yesterday that with the ongoing deficits beyond this year, you're going to have to make some more tough decisions between now and the next election, I assume, and maybe beyond. Are you mindful of the level of GDP, the proportion of GDP of income tax at all, or is that going to be a secondary concern when it comes to repairing the budget?
Oh, I am focused on it, but as you rightly identify in your question, you know, we've got structural challenges in the budget that we've got to fund, and part of that is alleviating some of the growth in the cost of these programs. Part of it is making sure that we can fund it. That's really what sits behind the motivations on the PRRT and super and multinational taxes and some of the other compliance measures in the budget. We've got a structural challenge in the budget. We made really good progress on it last night, but we've got more work to do. When it comes to the cap, I was standing right here, I remember it well, and you were standing right there, and I was up front with people and I said that I thought that that cap had been plucked out of the air, and it had been. And so I wasn't going to sign up to it. That involved an element of political risk at the time, but I was up front about it, and that still remains my view. But even if you accept the old tax cap of my predecessor, it doesn't breach it in the life of the forward estimates. We're still south in the forward estimates of what the Howard government had for tax to GDP. No doubt the opposition will make a lot out of all of this, but there are modest but meaningful tax changes in the budget. There is an upgrade to revenue as a consequence of people working more and earning more, and that's a good thing. And our priorities, we focus on it, but our priorities are largely elsewhere.
Charles Croucher.
Hi, Treasurer. Charles Croucher from the Nine Network. John Howard had his battlers, Scott Morrison had quiet Australians, Kevin Rudd had working families. What do you call that group? And more importantly, given their taxes helped create that surplus last night, when will their household budgets get that bit easier?
Well, I don't really want to carve up Australians into different groups and try and pit them against each other, I think when it comes to our priorities in the budget, we made them really clear last night. We want to support people who are doing it especially tough, at the same time as we support the legitimate aspirations of Middle Australia. And one of the things, you can say a lot of things about our government, but I think one of the things that I appreciate when it's said is that we are genuinely trying to govern for the whole place. Sometimes that means giving extra help to people who are doing it toughest, but typically we are trying to be a good, decent, middle-of-the-road government which recognises the legitimate aspirations that people have in Middle Australia. And so many of us are from communities which recognise that this idea of aspiration shouldn't just be limited to some Australians, it should be available to all Australians. When it comes to the cost of living pressures that people are confronting, you'll see in the budget that the forecast for inflation, that inflation is moderating. We think the peak was around Christmas time. It's not moderating as fast as we would like, but it is moderating, it is coming off. And the budget forecasts real wages growth a bit earlier at the start of next year rather than the middle of next year. And what we want to do and what we've tried to do in a budget which is otherwise really tight is we've tried to make some room to provide a bit of cost of living relief. Whether it's in payments, as we've been talking about in Laura's first question, whether it's tripling the bulk billing incentive for out-of-pocket health costs, help with energy costs. We're trying to make life a little bit easier for people within the constraints of a really responsible budget. So people are still doing it tough, but they would be doing it even tougher were it not for a government which is working around the clock to try and support them and take some of the sting out of these pressures.
Poppy Johnson.
Thanks, Treasurer. With fairly modest changes to improve housing affordability and boost housing supply in the budget, and the housing fund at risk of defeat in the Senate, have you got a plan B to tackle pressures on the housing market?
Well, we've got three parts of Plan A, Poppy. We've got the Housing Australia Future Fund that you reference, which has to pass the Parliament. I mean, the idea that the Parliament wants to vote against building more homes in a country where we've got incredibly low vacancy rates, incredibly high rents, the idea that the Parliament wouldn't support the building of tens of thousands of homes really, to me, just beggars belief. Second part is what you referenced from the budget last night, some tax breaks for build-to-rent properties. This is something I've been really focused on, partly because of the housing accord that I brought together in the course of the October budget. But these tax incentives for build-to-rent and for depreciation, they will make a difference. We will build more rental properties as a consequence of those policies. And then thirdly, we recognise that if you lined up the main pressures that are on people, out-of-pocket health costs we talked about with strengthening Medicare, energy costs, we've got the bill relief and the price caps. The other one is rent. And so I was really proud, frankly, to include in the budget last night the biggest increase in rent assistance for 3 decades. And I know that that won't make the pressures in the rental market disappear, but it will help people get through while we try and build more supply, which is our overwhelming objective when it comes to the housing market.
Andrew Probyn.
Treasurer Andrew Probyn, ABC. You referenced before the $15 billion that you hope to save from lowering the growth of the NDIS, and the 7 years after that, your ambition is for $59 billion in savings. So that's $74 billion all up. You talked about remembering the primary objective of the NDIS, and Bill Shorten only this morning was saying it was designed for those who are severely disabled. Are we to deduce from this and the fact that to get these savings, the federal government intends tightening eligibility for the NDIS?
Well, our intention here is to moderate the growth in the cost of the scheme, growing about 14%. It would still be growing quite quickly at 8%, but a little bit less than what it's currently growing. I think there's broad recognition that changes need to be made in the NDIS, and that the best way to do that is to work with the sector, to work with the NDIA, and to work with others to moderate costs in the scheme. I think it's in everybody's interest that we do that. Because if you go back to that primary objective that you were kind enough to reference, if your overwhelming objective here is to provide for people who are relying on the scheme that Labor designed, and it is, then you've got to make sure that it is affordable. And so Bill and the rest of the Cabinet will work closely with the NDIA and the sectors and the providers so that the cost of this scheme will still grow quite quickly over the life of the next decade, but where we can moderate those cost increases. Because if we can do that, we'll secure the future of the scheme at the same time as we put the budget on a more sustainable footing.
Mark Riley.
Mark Riley, Seven Network Treasurer. The bulk billing incentives, people are finding it difficult to find a bulk billing doctor today. Mm-hmm. The cost of living crunch is today. This doesn't start till November 1. Why do they have to wait 6 months? And I imagine you've modelled this $3.5 billion policy. What impact is it going to have on bulk billing rates? Because the expectation out there today is that parents are going to be able to take their kid to a GP and be bulk billed. Is that going to happen 100% of the time, 80% of the time, half the time?
Well, it will happen more frequently as a consequence of our policies. Tripling the bulk billing incentive, particularly for kids and people with concession cards, is the biggest investment that I can remember in strengthening Medicare. The problem is, as you described it, too many people can't find a bulk billing doctor, and it forces them to either not go to the doctor, even when they might need to, and it forces them to make trade-offs that we don't want them to make in their household budget. And so the $3.5 billion, part of more than $5 billion in the strengthening Medicare package, which was in the budget, devised by Mark Butler and other colleagues, is our attempt to try and shift the needle on bulk billing rates. And the reality of all of that is that more doctors will bulk bill as a consequence of us paying them 3 times what they were getting before to do it. And the other important detail is that the incentives in the bush are bigger than the incentives in the cities, still substantial in both cases now that we've tripled it. But this is also an investment in the bush to make sure that people can find a bulk billing doctor there.
The 6-month wait?
Oh, well, with all of these programs, we do what we can to implement them in a methodical way as soon as we can. And often it requires system change, it requires other changes. But November, in the grand scheme of things, is not an especially long time to wait for a multi-billion-dollar game-changing investment in Medicare.
Claire Armstrong.
Thanks, Treasurer. Claire Armstrong from the tabloids. You're going to appreciate this question. Even with power bill rebates and the impact of the reduction on bills from the gas and coal intervention, Australians are still paying more for their power bills now than they were 2 years ago. You often talk about being willing to have difficult conversations with Australians. Does that mean you're going to be upfront with them and say that $275 saving in 2025, based on their 2021 bill level, isn't coming?
Well, first of all, we're going to provide more than 5 million Australians with a bigger saving than that. up to $500 on their winter electricity bill. And I don't think that's nothing. That's an important consideration. Secondly, the $275 that you referred to was a forecast for modelling that was done before the Ukraine war, and there have been developments in the energy market since then. But it remains the case that the cheapest form of new power is renewable, increasingly reliable energy, and so that's why it's a big part of our agenda. Now, when it comes to power prices, the beginning of your question, one of the things that I was really hoping people would notice in the budget that we handed down last night is that forecast for electricity prices, which was going to be a 36% increase in electricity prices in the coming year, is now expected to be 10%. And when you take into consideration the rounding, it's about a 25 percentage point improvement in the energy forecast for that year. And that is a consequence of the decisive action that we took when we brought the Parliament back and imposed the caps and said that we would provide the relief. And that to me shows that the pressures that are on people from high electricity prices, we have been able to take some of the sting out of those high electricity prices, and we're proud of that.
Katina Curtis.
Thanks, Treasurer. Katina Curtis from the West Australian. The difference in the deficit in 23-24 and 24-25 is about just over $21 billion. As I understand it, that's almost the exact cost of the Stage 3 tax cuts.
I see where you're
in
going
that
here,
year.
Katina.
Are you borrowing to fund that tax cut?
Well, before last night's budget, last year, we were borrowing for all of these new commitments that were coming into the budget. And what Katie and I and the team have been able to do is to put the budget on a much more sustainable footing. I was asked yesterday how much the Stage 3 tax cuts cost over the life of the forward estimates, and I answered that question honestly. But the other honest part of the answer to your question is, these weren't a feature of our budget deliberations. They come in more than a year's time. They were legislated some time ago. They don't get a specific reference in the budget because they're an old decision already legislated. And I understand the interest in them, but our position on them hasn't changed. The fiscal position is clear. The fiscal position is much, much, much better as a consequence of the decisions underpinning last night's budget than they were in the October budget, and especially the March budget before that. But we've still got structural challenges in the budget, and we're very attentive to them.
Andrew Clennell.
Treasurer Andrew Clennell, Sky News.
You've got a big grin on your face, Andrew. That troubles me.
With unemployment at 3.5%, it seems in the vast majority of cases, if you want a job, you can get a job. So why do people on the dole get more money from the government out of this budget, but not a household on more than $160K a year who, for example, don't get the electricity bill relief? What do you say to those working full-time about why those on the dole get relief but they don't? And if the answer is Stage 3 tax cuts next year, why were you seemingly too ashamed of them to mention them in the budget?
Well, they weren't mentioned in the budget for the reason that I just gave in response to Katina's question. That's the first point. The second point is that a key feature and a welcome feature of our social security system is that more help goes to the people of the most modest means. That's a feature of social security. The third part of an answer to your question, and I've got it, in fairness, I've got it from a number of you around the room last night and this morning as well, because we've demonstrated, as Laura said, frankly, in her piece last night, that we haven't had to choose between budget responsibility and compassion for the most vulnerable people, that we've shown responsibility and compassion and empathy. Because we've done that and prioritised the people doing it toughest, I understand that people will ask what's in the budget for Middle Australia, and I'm so proud to get that question and pleased to get that question, because a key part of getting the wages moving again in this country after a decade of stagnation is about Middle Australia. So much of what we're doing in strengthening Medicare is about Middle Australia. So much of what we're doing in making medicines cheaper So much of the benefit from the price caps in the energy market are flowing through to Middle Australia. The cheaper early childhood education, which some of you have given us stick for being too generous to Middle Australia, that will be a game changer for working parents when that comes in on the 1st of July. There is so much that we're doing for Middle Australia in this budget, but when it comes to social security, I think there are good reasons why we prioritise the most vulnerable. And I'm not associating you necessarily with a piece of madness that I heard from Angus Taylor yesterday, but we're in the same general area when he told David Lipson that what worried him about our changes in social security was that it meant that the broader Australian community would be funding help for the most vulnerable. Well, that is the whole basis of social security. I mean, that is the whole basis of social security. And I think that our country is better, frankly, than the kind of downward envy that we hear about from time to time from people like Angus Taylor. I think the broader Australian community, they want a bit of help. They're getting help from us in the budget, but I think that there is a generosity inherent in the Australian character that says if you are doing it the toughest, you need the most help.
Stella Todorovic.
Stella from Network 10, thanks for your speech, Treasurer. Some economists are saying this surplus is a classic smoke and mirrors exercise. Those are their words. Why are they wrong? And most people in this room would be getting a pretty healthy stage 3 tax cut next year unless the budget repeals them. Just to clarify, are you guaranteeing that you won't be doing that? And if you do you still expect them to all show up?
Well, as you know, Stella, the second part of your question, we haven't changed our view about those stage 3 tax cuts. And in Katina's question, and I think in one other question, I think I've addressed that at some length. And can you remind me of the first part of your question?
Some economists are saying that this is a classic smoke and mirrors.
So the surplus that we're forecasting for 22-23 is a small surplus. We'll know for sure in September when we get the final budget outcome. I think there are really good reasons to be cautious about that. You haven't seen me wandering around here with the back in black mugs. I think that there are good reasons to be cautious about it. But what is already clear, what we don't need to wait until September to understand, is that without the substantial fiscal restraint that we showed, the discipline we imposed on the budget, the broader constraints that come from managing the budget and the economy more responsibly than our predecessors, without all of that effort, we wouldn't be within QE of a surplus in 22-23. And people will rightly raise with me the upward revisions to revenue that come from people working more and earning more, which is a good thing, from higher prices for our exports, also a good thing. But what really matters is when a government sits around a cabinet table, as we did, recognising that we're getting an upward revision in revenue, it matters what you do with that then. And we could spray it around like Costello did. You know, we could spray it around like Frydenberg and Morrison did. And we made a different choice. And we made a choice in the interests of the fiscal sustainability of the budget. And one of the fruits of that effort, some of the fruits of that effort, is the forecast surplus for this year.
Paul Carp.
Paul Carp from Guardian Australia. Thanks very much for your speech, Treasurer. This morning you said that you support giving back bracket creep to low and middle income earners, citing beneficiaries of stage 3 tax cuts at the lower end earning $45,000. Now, most plans to redesign stage 3 involve retaining the 37% tax bracket, which currently kicks in at $120,000.
Yeah.
So my question, please, are you as enthusiastic about giving bracket creep back to people earning 120, 130, 140, 150, 160, 170 and $180,000?
Well, first of all, the ideas that get put to us, which you reference in your question, Paul, you know, I listen respectfully to those ideas that are put to me about, you know, people who want to recast the stage 3 tax cuts. Really all I was trying to do this morning was to remind people, because I think sometimes it gets lost, that when you've got bracket creep, when you can afford to do it, you should look to return some of that bracket creep to people. And that has happened periodically under governments of both political persuasions. And if your question is there more than one way to do that? Of course there is. There is more than one way to return bracket creep to people in the tax system. But I think it's too often lost that the tax cuts kick in at $45,000. There is relief in there for people on lower and middle incomes as well as people on higher incomes. And I think it's important where we can that we provide relief to those people. Our position on the tax cuts hasn't changed. They weren't a focus of the deliberations in this budget. What we've been able to do instead is to support people of modest means in other ways.
Melissa Code.
Hi, Treasurer. Melissa Code from the Mandarin. During your first year as Treasurer, you've shared with us your vision of well-being and measuring what matters, and you also referenced in your essay values-based capitalism. I'm wondering if you can tell us when we might expect to see in a budget resourcing to a framework of that kind, maybe like something similar such as that in Wales, or in the alternative, whether future budgets in them we can expect that proposals will be assessed against a set of national goals.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Melissa, for your question, the opportunity to talk about this. You know, whether it's in the essay or more broadly, a number of you have heard me talk about, you know, if we want to get better economic outcomes in this country, we need to think differently about how we measure progress, and we need to renovate and revitalise our economic institutions as well. Huge priority for me. I'd like to leave behind, whenever I'm finished in this role, a set of more robust institutions and more robust measurements of progress so that people, you know, governments in the future are judged against some agreed metrics for national progress. In the budget, and I wanted to pay tribute to Andrew Lee, who's over there, the fastest, longest runner in the Parliament, for his work on what began as the Evaluator General but has become the Policy Impact Team. And what we were able to do in the budget, because of Andrew's great work, is to make evaluation a more central part of our economic policy levers and considerations. I'll release Measuring What Matters, our equivalent of the Wellbeing Framework, towards the middle of the year. There'll be an intergenerational report this year as well. There'll be the Employment White Paper. We've got to bed down the changes to the RBA. I am looking seriously at renovating the Productivity Commission, and all of this work is of a piece.
Ben Westcott.
Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. Thank you so much for your speech, Treasurer. In the budget, you've spoken about how the dangers from a slowing global economy have been offset by the unexpectedly strong reopening of China earlier this year. But the economic indicators out of China in the past month have not really been great. We've got slowing imports, slowing exports, lower PMI. If China's economic growth turns out to be softer than we'd hoped or expected, does that endanger the already low GDP growth that we're seeing in the next financial year? Does it raise the risk of recession?
Well, it certainly increases the risk of a more substantial downturn. And when you look at the commentary in the budget papers, and we try and be careful not to overdo it, but in the global economy, the risks are tilted to the downside in the language of the Treasury documents. There are real concerns about the global economy. I knock around with my colleagues and counterparts from the big 20 economies, and I knock around with the IMF and the World Bank and others, and there is a lot of concern in the global economy, the combination of a big slowdown, maybe a hard landing in the US, and what that would mean for us here in Australia. And the hope of the side in the forecast, as you rightly identify, is a slightly stronger outlook for China, but that's not without its risks as well. So what the budget forecasts is a slowing in growth in our economy as a consequence of the combination of the slowing global economy, the impact of those rate rises in our own economy, and the pressure that people are feeling from inflation. The forecasts in the budget are the central case, but what we try to do there is acknowledge, as you do in your question, that there's a lot that can go wrong in the global economy, China, US and elsewhere. And that's why we need to get the budget in a much, much more sustainable position to try and rebuild some of those buffers against this global turbulence that we're seeing.
Treasurer, it's 25 to 2. I'm conscious you've got question time. Are you happy to take about another
Let's take Amanda's and then we might have to call it a day.
Sorry?
Is it 25-2?
It's 25-2.
Yeah, let's take Amanda's and then call it a day.
Okay, fine. Yeah. Amanda Cobb.
Thank you. Would have been very mean if you'd
it would have been
back
mean.
down. Amanda Kopp from the Community Radio Network and National Radio News. Your government has determined that children need additional support until the age of 14 through the single parent payment. Yet the same thinking isn't applied in the criminal justice system. The age of criminal responsibility still remains at just 10 years old, one of the lowest in the world. How is this consistent?
Well, thanks, Amanda. Obviously that's a really important issue, but I've got to be upfront with you and say that I haven't spent a lot of the last couple of weeks thinking about that. I know we've had discussions at our end, the Attorney-General, the Minister for First Nations people. We've had discussions about this in the past, but it hasn't been a big focus of my efforts in the last few weeks. There'll be a government position on that, no doubt, and I'd encourage you to speak to the relevant ministers about it.
Please thank the Treasurer for speaking to us today.
Thank you.